On a quiet morning before dawn, when most of America was still trying to understand what Pearl Harbor really meant, a strange idea was already taking shape. It was an idea so risky that many senior officers quietly hoped it would fail. They wanted to send a handful of men, barely 40 at first, into a jungle filled with tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers. These men were not polished heroes. Many had been written off. Some had been court-martialed. Some had violent pasts. Some were simply too hard to control. But what happened next did not just shock the enemy. It changed American warfare forever and planted the roots of what would one day become the Navy SEALs. The story begins on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. Washington was in chaos. Phones rang without stopping. Maps were rolled out across long tables. The Japanese Empire was advancing fast across the Pacific. Guam fell. Wake Island was under attack. The Philippines were burning. American leaders knew they were not ready for a long jungle war against an enemy who had trained for it for decades. Traditional infantry tactics were too slow, too loud, too predictable. Something new was needed, and fast. In a small office inside the Navy Department, Captain William Wild Bill Donovan was already arguing that America needed special units trained for sabotage, deep raids, and psychological warfare. At the same time, across the country, a Marine Corps officer named Lieutenant Colonel Evans Fordyce Carlson was thinking the same thing. Carlson had spent years in China. He had lived with guerrilla fighters. He had seen how small, fast units could break much larger forces, and he believed something radical for his time. He believed that the best fighters were not always the best soldiers on paper. Carlson returned to the United States in early 1942, frustrated and angry. He believed the Marine Corps was stuck in old thinking: parades, shiny boots, rigid discipline. None of that mattered in a jungle ambush at night. What mattered was initiative, aggression, and the ability to move silently and survive with almost nothing. He proposed a new unit, a raiding force, small, flexible, deadly. At first, many generals laughed at him, but the war situation was getting worse. On February 15, 1942, Singapore fell. More than 80,000 Allied troops surrendered. It was one of the worst defeats in British military history. Panic quietly spread among Allied planners. If the Japanese reached Australia, the Pacific War could be lost. Desperation opened doors that pride had kept shut. In March 1942, the Marine Corps approved an experiment. They would create special raiding units. They would be called Marine Raiders. 2 battalions were authorized. The first under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson. The second under Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson. And this is where the legend of the criminals began. Carlson did not recruit like a normal officer. He ignored clean records and perfect uniforms. He went looking for men who had already proven they could survive chaos. He took volunteers from stockades, men who had been arrested for fighting, disobedience, or desertion. Not murderers, not traitors, but men who lived on the edge, men the system had failed, or men who refused to fit into it. Many officers warned him. These men would break discipline. They would mutiny. They would run. Carlson answered calmly. If they run, they were never fighters. If they fight, they will fight like demons. By April 1942, his battalion was forming at Camp Elliott, near San Diego. The unit would officially be called the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. Inside the battalion, there was no "sir" spoken. Carlson removed traditional rank privileges. Officers ate the same food as enlisted men. They trained together. They suffered together. Carlson introduced a concept he had learned in China. He called it gung-ho. It meant working together, shared hardship, shared purpose. Training was brutal. Long marches with little sleep. Live-fire drills at night. Knife fighting, silent movement. Men dropped from the program weekly. Some broke physically, some mentally. But those who stayed became something different. They learned to kill quietly. They learned to move without leaving tracks. They learned to disappear into jungle shadows. By the summer of 1942, the Japanese had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. They were building an airfield that could threaten Australia. The United States could not allow that. On August 7, 1942, US Marines landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. The island was hell. Thick jungle. Disease. Heat. The Japanese fought fanatically. They attacked at night, screaming through the darkness. By September, American forces were barely holding on. Supplies were short. Morale was breaking. The Japanese still controlled much of the island's interior. Intelligence was poor. Patrols vanished. Something had to be done to disrupt the enemy deep behind the lines. That mission went to Carlson's raiders. On October 30th, 1942, before sunrise, Carlson gathered his men near the Lunga perimeter. The raid would not be a short strike. It would be a long patrol deep into enemy territory. They would move light. No tents, limited food, no resupply. Their mission was vague by design. Disrupt Japanese forces, destroy supply units, gather intelligence, and survive. Carlson's force numbered about 220 men, not just 40. But within those ranks were the core group that built the legend. Men who had been labelled troublemakers. Men who thrived when rules faded. Facing them somewhere in the jungle were more than 30,000 Japanese soldiers under General Harukichi Hyakutake. The raiders vanished into the jungle. For 30 days they lived like ghosts. They moved mostly at night. During the day, they hid under leaves and mud. They ambushed Japanese patrols at close range. 10 yards, 5 yards, sometimes closer. Knives, silent shots. The Japanese never knew how many Americans were out there. It felt like hundreds. On November 6, 1942, near the Metapona River, Carlson's men stumbled onto a large Japanese supply column. Instead of pulling back, Carlson attacked. The firefight lasted less than 15 minutes. When it ended, more than 70 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The raiders melted back into the jungle before reinforcements arrived. Hunger became constant. Men ate captured rice, sometimes raw. Malaria spread. Dysentery followed. One man collapsed and begged to be left behind. Carlson refused. The unit carried him for 2 days until he could walk again. That decision saved lives later. Trust mattered more than speed. The Japanese responded with rage. They sent larger patrols. They shelled suspected raider positions. But the jungle swallowed Carlson's men. Every night, another ambush, another explosion, another supply dump burned. The psychological effect was massive. Japanese officers reported being hunted by invisible forces. By November 20th, after nearly a month behind enemy lines, Carlson's raiders returned to American positions. They were skeletons, beards grown wild, clothes rotting. But they had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers, destroyed critical supplies, and gathered intelligence that helped turn the Battle of Guadalcanal. The raid proved something powerful. Small units, properly trained, could change the course of a campaign. News of the raiders spread quietly through military circles, not through headlines, through whispers. Army planners took notes. Navy officers paid attention. The idea of elite units trained for unconventional warfare no longer seemed dangerous. It seemed necessary. As the war continued, similar units formed. The Navy created Naval Combat Demolition Units in 1943 to clear beach obstacles for amphibious landings. These men trained under brutal conditions. Cold water, explosives, long swims. Many were former troublemakers too. Men who did not fit standard Navy life, but excelled under pressure. On June 6, 1944, during the Normandy landings, these demolition teams went ashore under fire. Casualties were horrific. In some units, more than 50% were killed or wounded in minutes. But they cleared the beaches. Without them, D-Day might have failed. In the Pacific, the Navy expanded these teams into underwater demolition teams, known as UDTs. They reconnoitred beaches before invasions. They swam at night. They mapped reefs. They destroyed obstacles. Many were Marines and sailors who had learned their craft from the raiders' philosophy: speed, surprise, aggression. After World War II ended in August 1945, many believed special units would fade away. But the Cold War began almost immediately. Korea erupted in 1950. Once again, small teams were needed for reconnaissance and raids. UDTs operated along the Korean coast, sabotaging rail lines and gathering intelligence. By January 1962, with Vietnam escalating, the US Navy officially established the sea, air and land teams. SEAL Team 1 and SEAL Team 2 were born. Their lineage traced directly back to the raiders and UDTs. Their training reflected the same ideas Carlson had pushed 20 years earlier: initiative, adaptability, shared hardship. The myth of the criminals was never fully true, but it carried a deeper truth. These units thrived because they accepted men who thought differently, men who questioned orders when needed, men who could operate alone, far from command, and still complete the mission. Carlson died in 1947, long before the SEALs were created. He never saw how far his ideas travelled, but his influence remained. Every time a small team inserts behind enemy lines, every time discipline bends to mission needs, every time unconventional thinking saves lives. The Japanese never forgot the raiders either. After the war, captured documents revealed how deeply those jungle raids had shaken their command structure on Guadalcanal. They believed they were facing a much larger force. Fear multiplied the raiders' strength. Today, Navy SEALs are known worldwide. Movies, books, headlines. But their roots are quieter. They trace back to a time when America was losing, when desperation allowed innovation, when a few officers dared to trust men others had discarded. It began not with glory, but with risk, with sending a small group into a jungle filled with enemies, with believing that character mattered more than records. And in that gamble, modern special warfare was born. What started as an experiment in 1942 became a doctrine. What began with raiders crawling through jungle mud became operators moving through deserts and seas. And it all goes back to that moment when someone said, "Send them anyway," and history changed course.